Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I do hope it finds you well. My name is John, and I am an author, and I'm coming you here today for another Storytime Thursday to read chapter 5 of my first book, The Shadow of the Past. I hope you enjoy, and I do encourage you and hope you check out and purchase or read my book down below. And also let me know what you think. So settle in, grab a cup of coffee or tea, or whatever floats your boat, and let's get cracking. All right. Chapter 5, The Riders of the Wind. It was long into the night before Val'inar and Narthan stopped to rest and eat. The sky was cloudless and brilliant with stars, and to the east the small sliver of the waning moon was rising. The breeze was stiff that night, rippling the grass and bringing a slight chill to the air. The elf and dwarf decided to stop near a small grove of trees where they collected wood. They lit a fire in a small, steep valley between three hills, which was completely hidden from sight of the nearest dwellings, a few miles distant, but was only partially sheltered from the wind. After several unsuccessful attempts to light the fire with flint and tinder, the dwarf held his hand toward the fire and muttered in his own language. After a few seconds, a tongue of fire leapt from his hand and caught the wood ablaze. After they had eaten a small amount of food from their provisions, they got down to talking. Remembering what had puzzled him the most in his first conversation with the elf, it was Narthan who started the conversation. Tell me, Val'inar, what you are? You are unlike any elf that I have ever met. Val'inar was silent for a few moments. I was hesitant to speak openly on meeting you, but I suppose it won't hurt to speak further. Narthan fixed Val'inar with his eyes and waited for him to continue. Val'inar took a deep breath. I said that I was the son of Theros, which in a sense is still true, but our better name would be that I am the son of Yanira. I am indeed from the Taranu forest, but I am not a forest elf. Narthan raised an eyebrow and said, That answers my question, but tells me nothing. Are you going to explain that contradiction? Validar nodded slowly and responded, I can understand your confusion, Narthan, as until recently I had not known that the one I had called father my whole life had adopted me. My mother was Yanira, and I am one of the Se'era Elfen, the last of that people in point of fact, or so I am told. Tharas Ha'atha of Gyratha adopted me after my mother gave her life to bring me into this world. Narthan pondered this for several minutes before addressing the elf once more. Tell me, why is it that different groups of elves look so different from one another? In my time, I have had dealings with the water elves that live in the cliffs of the crashing sea, the dark elves of Astrael, and the forest elves of Tuoranu and the Haltar ridges. There is something unmistakably elven about them, but at the same time, they seem so different. You also possess different characteristics than those others. The elf's reply was quick in coming. The answer to your question is the strong bond that exists between an elf and the area. Elves take on physical characteristics that reflects the element or elements of area they are bonded to. Appear differently bonded to. I appear differently from other elves because I have a bond with all elements of area equally, whereas most groups of elves are connected with only one. So within you, the influence of the various harmonies of Graz balance themselves out? Yes. Narthan stared into the fire with a look of deep concentration upon his face until finally he seemed to have recalled what he was racking his brain for and said, In our old stories, I seem to recall a group of elves who possess such balance within the grot. The tales call them the High Builders. Are you of that people? Val'inar shrugged. I am not sure, but I guess that would be the case. My thanks for answering my question so promptly, and my apologies as well if this line of talk troubles you. It is not troublesome to me, said Val'inar. They sat in silence for a short time before the elf spoke again, saying, You sound as if you are quite well traveled. Have you been over the entirety of Sirana? Not all, but I have been seen much of it, replied the dwarf. I am a bard of Lord Irtla. What Narthan, taking notice of the elf's inquisitive expression, began speaking again before the elf could finish his question. Bart roughly translates as advisor, My particular role is to act as the representative of Lord Irtla and of all Graphic dwarves in matters of trade and dealings with outsiders. You have a position of great honor then. How then do you come to travel without escort? I am head of the Urda clan, and I have earned my position through hard work and decades of service to Lord Irtla and to his father before him, said Narthan proudly before continuing in a more somber tone. I have traveled the wider world much as both a soldier and a trader. As such, my knowledge is sufficient to travel easily without armed escort, and as I noted to you in the tavern, on this journey I came to investigate, that is easier without the attention brought by guards. Could not some other of lesser importance have been sent rather than risk your own life to obtain information on the Union? It had to be me, said the dwarf simply. Such an investigation required subtlety, and I am one of the very few with sufficient knowledge to move about Fetra effectively and with enough command of the trade language to acquire information. And besides, I gained this position through hard and diligent work, and I am not about to change that now. Val'inar pondered this for a moment before addressing the dwarf again. Do your people have good relationships with your neighbors? The dwarf sighed heavily before replying. Until recently, yes, save for the Krelvan goblins. But in recent years, the relationship between us and the other lands of Sirana has begun to sour. You say that the cause is this malevolence that lies beneath the Gratz, but whatever the cause, all nations seem to take offense and quarrel over the smallest of excuses. It has been difficult to maintain the old ties. The elf nodded grimly at this news. These petty differences must be overcome somehow. Perhaps if the people of Sirana could be shown how foolish such quarrels are. Unlikely. Then perhaps they can be made to focus this anger onto something else. I doubt that the Union will make such actions easy. They have been very prudent in their alliances and conquests. They are also clearly employing some form of coercion or manipulation to get Kamral to join them so quickly. I wonder if we might not all soon be following the words of the prophetess. The elf shook his head in obvious frustration. While I seek information on this union and its goals, I must do what I can to restore the old alliances, or at least overcome some of these feuds. Finding out what is behind the union and this hatred will do little if they have already succeeded. Narthan arched his eyebrow in surprise. What do you think you can accomplish? I don't know. Perhaps I can serve as a mediator between different groups. After all, as someone from outside and completely unknown, I could serve as a neutral voice. Diplomacy is far more difficult than you make it sound, observed Narthan sternly. Still, I suppose it wouldn't hurt for you to try. Try what? I fear that the Graphic dwarves and the Krelvan goblins will soon be at war. We have skirmished often, even warred over the centuries, but there has been peace, though not without dispute for several generations now. However, this recent conflict, which has developed over mining rights, may well plunge both of our peoples into a war from which we will not recover from for decades. All attempts at discussion have failed almost before they have begun, in which case it wouldn't hurt to let you try your hand at mediation. Thank you. For what? For being willing to allow me to try and help with such an important matter. There is some way I can repay you, name it. Narthan smiled at this. Make any progress at all, and that will be all the repayment I could possibly need. Fail, and we are headed toward war regardless. The following 3 days were much the same for Val'inar and Narthan. They walked from dawn until after nightfall, taking a little sustenance at waking and eating a light meal when they stopped to rest. Water there was in plenty in the Shaddai plains. Elf and dwarf kept a quick pace over the plains, but saw nothing aside from birds and beasts, for they took care to avoid the scattered villages and farms. Despite gray clouds dominating the sky for the second and third day, the rain held off and did not trouble the travelers. It was on the second day that the elf began to get worried because at times he thought he could hear the tramp of horse hooves and occasionally thought he saw in the distance the briefest sight of a horse and rider. However, whenever he stopped to take another look or listen, he could no longer see or hear anything. Val'inar informed his companion that night of his suspicions so that both were keeping a careful watch all the next day, but again neither could see nor hear anything aside from the quickest glimpse and the briefest sound. By the time they stopped on the third day out of Fetra, they were both convinced that something or someone was tracking them. This made little sense to either of them, since any tracker possessing horses could easily have reported their location, and any skilled enough to keep themselves so well hidden on an open plain would likely be able to sneak up on them in the night. However, they had yet to see any armed group coming to waylay them, and Val'inar, himself a skilled tracker, could detect no sign that anyone had been near them in the night. Val'inar rose just before dawn the following day, the fourth since Fetra, and he set about gathering their gear into packs for the day's journey. He took out a few elven biscuits and a few strips of dried meat Narthan carried. He took a long drink of water from his bottle and then went to the stream they camped next to in order to refill both bottles. The first sliver of the sun was peeking up above the plain, lighting up a sky mercifully free of clouds, when he returned to where they had camped and was covering the last embers of the fire when the dwarf awoke. They ate their biscuits and meat in silence, and after taking long drinks of water, the dwarf took both bottles to the stream and filled them again. When he returned, they took up their packs and set off towards the Orthris Mountains. The mountains were getting larger every day, and now they dominated the entire view ahead of them. From that distance, it looked as if the snow-capped peaks of the Orthris Mountains simply erupted right out of the plain to a dizzying height, though the ground upon which they walked was gently sloped upwards. As they walked, Narthan would occasionally point out some slight change of course that needed to be made in order for Val'inar himself to come by the straightest road possible to the doors of Murtzel, which he named as the most direct path to the heart of Grothic territory. It was getting toward evening of that day when at last what Val'inar and Narthan had feared came to pass. In the distance ahead of them, they spotted a column of soldiers. Due to the sparse cover afforded by the landscape, the soldiers spotted elf and dwarf shortly after they were seen by Val'inar. There was no way for them to hide. It became also apparent also that the soldiers were wearing the tabards of the Union, and the speed they suddenly displayed upon seeing the elf and dwarf made it likely that they had been sent to find them. As they neared, Narthan saw that the head of the column was a middle-aged man of distinguished but scarred features who was quite tall. He wore a long set of chainmail links with a steel breastplate over top. He also had a helmet of good iron and gauntlets and greaves also made of steel and leggings of thick leather. A long sword was at his hip and a round shield on his back. His soldiers, of which there were 20, were equipped with chainmail as well as iron caps, gauntlets, and greaves. They carried short swords on their waists and spears in their hands. Narthan, upon seeing the soldiers, began to look carefully around the plain to see what course of action could be taken. After he had done so, he glanced up at Val'inar. The elf returned a glance which said he was thinking the same thing. They were in trouble. The soldiers were directly between them and where they needed to go, and the openness of this area of the plain made it unlikely that they could get around the soldiers by speed or stealth. By the same token, they could not flee, as their flight would be carefully followed by the pursuing soldiers. The terrain also favored numbers rather than skill, and by their bearing, these would not be so easy to overcome as the guards in Fetra. "None of our choices is pleasing me," said Val'inar as he drew his selkir and balanced the blade carefully upon his shoulder. "But it seems the only option is to fight." Narthan grunted in assent as he loosed his double-bladed axe from his belt and carefully examined the blade. "If we are to die, let us see if we can take a lot of them with us." "Our death is not certain, but neither is our victory," responded the elf. "I would simply have preferred to avoid patrols altogether than to have to risk engaging one, let alone under circumstances unfavorable to us." "Would the balances not be tipped in our favor by our skills in magecraft?" rumbled the dwarf. "That could indeed tip this confrontation in our favor, but I fear that it may bring far more trouble down upon us in the end," mused the elf. "Magic is far too easy to trace and track, especially in an open environment such as this." "Clearly, we have already been tracked," observed the dwarf. "No, our horse pursuer is not of the Union, or at least has not reported our whereabouts," said Val'inar. We have been heading in a constant direction since we left Fetra. However, these soldiers were heading in a different direction and turned when they spotted us. They may have been warned of us, but they did not appear to have been told where we were. Their approach seems more unhappy chance than anything else. Let us hope that this encounter proves to be an unhappy chance for those soldiers rather than for us, laughed the dwarf. No, I do not hope that, answered Val'inar gravely. They are likely only doing as ordered. Narthan laughed aloud at this. True, but overly kind. Even if they are simply pawns, I will still kill these soldiers if it comes down to a contest between us. It would be foolish not to, said Val'inar reluctantly. I was simply saying that I do not find myself hating these soldiers simply for carrying out the desires of their masters. Then let us slay them swiftly, said Narthan grimly. Let them act first, replied the elf with a sigh. They may not be looking for us. Let us also try to prevail without magic, although the choice may quickly be taken from us. By this time, the column was closing in, and the soldiers were beginning to spread out to surround the elf and dwarf. Once the two were enclosed within the ring of soldiers, the commander stepped forward and addressed the travelers. What are you two doing so armed, traveling through Camral? Said the commander. I am Narthan of the Graphic Dwarves, and I am returning home, replied the dwarf, stepping forward. This elf is a companion of mine and is traveling with me as an emissary to my lord and people. The commander laid his hand on his sword and smiled grimly. An elf from the Taranu, perhaps? We are under orders that if any such were to cross our paths, that they were to be immediately apprehended. You, friend dwarf, had best come along as well for questioning. Both the elf and dwarf raised their weapons, and the soldiers, in response, pointed their spears at the two travelers. It was at this moment that Narthan once more heard the galloping hoofbeats of horses, and he momentarily went slack as he pondered what it could mean. A sideways glance showed that Val'inar had the same reaction. Don't be foolish, said the commander, breaking Narthan's contemplation. We have you outnumbered and surrounded. I have no desire to injure you. Drop your weapons so I won't have to. The hoofbeats were much louder by now, to the point where the soldiers were looking around to find their source. And then all of a sudden the air was rent with the twang of a bowstring. The commander's facial expression changed slowly as he staggered backward and looked down at the arrow protruding from his throat. His mouth gaped in silent agony, and he slumped to the ground. Narthan and Val'inar both turned their heads and saw a dozen or so horsemen riding hard towards them. The sound of more bowstrings was heard, and another cluster of soldiers collapsed. Val'inar and Narthan reacted first and set upon the bewildered soldiers. The fight lasted but a moment. The horsemen's arrows felled the majority, with the sword of Val'inar claiming 2 and the axe of Narthan 3. The horsemen wore leather vests and loose-fitting trousers that were tan in color. They were unarmed save for their bows made of heathy wood and a quiver of arrows upon their back. They rode bareback upon small but powerful-looking horses. Their heads were bare, allowing long dark hair to stream in the wind, and they bore no markings of any kind save for a band of green cloth tied around their right arms. The man who appeared to be their leader rode up to the travelers and dismounted. He was middle-aged, with lines of gray in his hair and a weather-beaten but handsome face. He wore a green sash about his waist and walked with the distinct bow-legged gait of one who had spent their life on horseback. Val'inar stepped forward and addressed the horsemen. We owe our lives to you, men of the Trae. To what do we owe the timeliness of your assistance? We are scouts, replied the man, somewhat uneasily in the trade language. We have tracked you since Fetra. It is our hatred of this tribe of steel men which brings our aid. Who are you that know the Trae? Val'inar bowed deeply to the man. I am Val'inar of the Taranu forest, and this is my companion Narthan of the Graphic Dwarves, he said, as Narthan also bowed. May I ask why you are following us? I am Gilth, first Orst, replied the man, inclining his head. We wish to know why you two would leave Fetra and travel on foot with speed. We also killed a messenger some weeks ago ordering the capture of Taranu elves, and the Quar ordered we watch. We are in your debt, Gilth, said Narthan, stepping forward, and we thank you for allowing us to continue our journey to the doors of Murtzel. As soon as I am safe among my own people, I assure you that I will demonstrate my gratefulness to your people in full. It is good that you needed saving, replied Gilth. These steel ones were making a camp at the roots of the mountain near the stone tribe's door. If you had stayed this path, they would have captured you. Then we shall be even more in your debt if you can tell us the best way around this encampment. It is important that we make it to the Orthris Mountains as quickly as possible, said the elf, looking concerned. We shall do so, but first we go to our fjord, responded the horseman. It is near, and it is the request of the Triquar that you do so. After you have met her and rested, we will have you to the dwarves before the sun sets tomorrow. Come, the sun sinks. Both elf and dwarf found this arrangement acceptable, so they immediately set off out in a northeasterly direction at a brisk pace. The other horsemen spread out to make sure that they were not spotted by any other Union patrols, but Gilth walked his horse beside the two travelers and conversed with them. They shared with them what had occurred in Fetra, and Gilth told them of his people. Narthan had heard of the tribe, but he knew little about them, as they had little use for the iron and stonework of the dwarves, and the dwarves had little use for woven goods or horses. Gilth and Narthan were both puzzled that Val'inar seemed to have some knowledge of the Trae, since the Trae didn't trade directly with the Tiranu elves either. Gilth explained that the Trae, short for Trae Shaalta, which in their own tongue means people of the wind, were a group of nomads that had lived upon the Shaddai plains for generations uncounted. Small raids between the different tribes and against other peoples living on or near the plain were common, but they were rarely involved in any full-scale war. Other groups tended to stay out of their way. A tacit, if not always unbloodied, peace had long existed between the Trae and Cambral, which had recently been shattered by the Union taking control of Cambral. Apparently, having failed in their overture of peace, the Union now sought to subjugate the Trae. To counter this threat, one of the Triquar, a wind summoner, was calling all tribes together to meet the threat. The Trae lived in encampments called Fior, made primarily of tents. Their society was organized into tribes which tended to live separately from one another, and each tribe was divided into clans, which were further divided into individual families. Each clan had a quar who acted as a leader, healer, and priestess to her clan and aided the soldiers with her powers in battle. The most powerful quar was given the title of Triquar and honored above by all the tribes and clans. Generally, the eldest member of the most powerful clan was the military head of the tribe, called the Orst, but in certain circumstances, as was the case with Gilth, who was only in his 40s, a man of younger age could become the Orst if they displayed extreme courage and tactical ability. The tribes were ruled by a council comprising of all the clan elders and the Orst, with the Triquar at the head. In the rare circumstances that the Trae as a whole would go to war, the Orst of the most powerful tribe was designated leader and was given the title of Fair Orst, answering only to the Triquar. After several hours' walk, they came at last to the Fior at dusk. Coming over a hill, they saw on the plain in front of them a vast city of tents. Giving the Fior a quick glance, Val'inar judged there had to be several thousand tents at least. Each tent had a roped-off enclosure behind it where horses were tethered. At the very limit of the elf's visions, he could see a vast herd of cattle, sheep, goats, and other animals guarded by a number of horsemen. As they reached the fjord and began to move down one of the larger paths toward an exceptionally large tent at the center, elf and dwarf looked with interest at what looked to be preparations for war. Swords were being sharpened, arrows were being made, animal hides were being boiled into leather and sewn into vests, and many of the people they saw were armed. Their gaze of interest was met with looks of interest mixed with caution. It was clear that none of them had ever seen a dwarf before, and few had seen an elf. They were clearly curious to know who and what Val'inar and Narthan were, and whether or not they were prisoners. So great was the fear that it took them some time to reach the tent of the Triquar. There were half a dozen men before the entrance of the tent, and they bade Val'inar and Narthan disarm before entering the presence of the Triquar. This they did, and Gilth led them into the tent. They passed through several antechambers before coming to a compartment larger than many whole tents, which had another group of guards before it. The room was well furnished with skillfully woven fabrics and wicker chairs. Skins of a variety of animals adorned the ground and many of the walls. The space was warm and well lit by numerous torches and braziers. The smoke escaped through several holes at the top of the tent. Toward the back of the chamber stood a dais upon which was an ornately carved throne of Hurrian wood. The woman sitting upon the throne looked to be about 40. She had sleek brown hair which fell to her waist and was held back by a beautifully carved wooden clasp. Her skin was tanned and her brown eyes were clear and inquisitive. She had a wide face with a small nose, soft cheekbones, and a well-defined jaw. She wore a tight-fitting garment made of lirgoose skin, and her feet were bare. The garment had short sleeves, barely covering her shoulders. It came down to just above her ankles and was bound in front with a tie. Her arms and legs were heavily tattooed, and she had gold clasps on her upper arms and silver wrist guards on each arm. She had an athletic build and sat with legs and arms crossed as the traveler entered. When they got nearer the throne, she looked up suddenly and for a moment displayed a look of surprise before collecting herself. Gilth walked forward and knelt down before introducing them. Most High Triquar Desalia, said Gilth in a trade tongue, your designs are fulfilled. I have brought the ones which the city dwellers seek. They say they travel on an errand of grave importance. On this errand they were making for the door in the mountains when a patrol of those bearing the yellow eye waylaid them. My Malvra aided the dispatch of these soldiers, and I have led them here at your command. Welcome to my fjord, said Desalia in a deep and quiet voice. It seems that the Eye followers hunt stories, as I thought that was the only place elves still dwelled in this part of the world, unless I miss my guess as to what you are. Your guess is indeed correct, my lady, responded Val'inar, bowing low. I am Val'inar, an elf of the Toranu forest, where many elves yet dwell. We avoid the forest as a place of mystery to us, said Desalia, who then turned to Narthan. It is unfrequent indeed that we have dealings with one of your race, Master Dwarf, although our people have long dwelt near the mountains. I am called Narthan, grunted Narthan, bowing low, and I am the Bart of Irtla, lord of the Graphic Dwarves. I have traveled from the mountains in order to determine what was going on in Camral, and now return with grave news. Desalia once more turned her gaze to Val'inar. And what business have you, Master Elf, to travel beyond the safety of your forest? Valinar's face became grim. I am traveling because I wish to understand what the Union is doing and find an answer to the malevolence that lies beneath the array. It is my hope that I can find some way to avert the doom that plagues my dreams. Desalia's face became serious at the mention of malevolence and was silent for a moment before she spoke again. I too have sensed something stirring beneath the Trilare. Tell me more of this doom that you speak of. Val'inar explained all that he knew about both the Union and the visions of doom. Narthan and Desalia both filled in their dealings with the Union. It was clear that the Union was not what it claimed to be, and all agreed that there was far too much coincidence for it not to have something to do with the malevolence that was creeping into the world. What exactly the connection was, however, none could say. It seems you are right, Val'inar, said Desalia, standing up from her throne. Whatever the Union is, it is a threat and seeks to oppress us. Along with the advances they have already made against us, this news says we should prepare for war all the more. Val'inar nodded at this. Indeed, I would urge you to continue arming, but not to make any aggressive moves against Camral, for fear that it drives them into closer alliance with the Union. We must find some way to get Camral to rebel against the Union. And how will that be done exactly? Said Desalia, pacing back and forth on the dais. Are we just to wait here for them to destroy us? We do not have the strength to fight either Camral or the Union should they turn their attention wholly to us. I do not believe they are ready to take such an action, replied Narthan. I believe the Union's heart is still far to the east and north. It will be some time before Camral is pacified enough for them to move that army away from striking distance of Takaran. As for Camral, the Union won't allow them to mass any army of significance yet, for fear of losing control. Very well, nodded Desalia. As long as my people are not seriously threatened, I will do as you suggest. We will continue our preparations for war and keep close watch over the Shadai plains for movement of any military forces. I will not promise not to strike at the enemies of the Trae Shaalta should it become necessary to do so. And what, may I ask, will the two of you be doing? Val'inar responded, "We will travel to the mountains where I intend to seek information and aid. I will also be attempting to resolve the dispute between the dwarves and goblins. Afterwards, I will likely continue north on the same task." If that dispute is able to be dealt with," said Narthan, "there will be much to discuss with Lord Irtla as to what role the graphic will play in all of this." "You have my support, Val'inar," said the Triquar quietly, "for as long as it benefits my people to give it. I will be ready when war does come. Bard Narthan, I would have you go with Gilth to discuss the particulars of the dwarven stance in this matter, and I will discuss the elven view with Val'inar. Such understanding may help us all in the days to come." Narthan and Gilth both bowed and exited the chamber. Once they were gone, Desalia motioned the guards at the door that they were to step out as well. Once they had gone, she turned to Val'inar, raised her right arm, and concentrated, creating a swirling ball of wind in her cupped hand. The woman and the elf stared at each other down for several seconds before Desalia waved her arm and sent the ball of wind at Val'inar. Before it had gotten halfway to him, Val'inar waved his left arm lazily in front of him, and the ball of wind doubled in size, reversed directions, and hit Desalia, forcing her to sit down upon her throne. Desalia stood up and said grimly, "I never could get the better of you." "True," said Val'inar, smiling as he took several steps toward her, "but clearly my tutelage paid off. You must be the youngest Triquar in your people's history." "I had the power all along," replied Desalia, stepping down from the dais. "You simply taught me to control it." Val'inar laughed. "Contrary as ever, I see. You have clearly done well in such a short time." "A short time for you, perhaps," said Desalia, smiling at last. 20 years is a long time for a human, and I suppose I have changed a lot. Did you tell anyone about the teaching I gave you?" "No, not even Gilth, who is my life mate, knows. I was sent out into the wilderness alone in order to commune with the wind spirits and thus learn my power. I doubt my people would have looked kindly to me being taught by an elf if anyone even believed that in the first place." "True, but you would have no doubt learned to control the area of wind even without my help. I taught you for 3 months only. You learned much, but as you said, the power was yours all along." "I would have learned how to use my power, but I would not be where I am today without your aid. It was the elven way of controlling the area and your methods of spell weaving that gave me the decisive advantage in the tests of skill when the last Triquar passed into the sky. I am glad that the brief time we spent together gave you some benefits. When the Ahatha found out about my teaching you, he was furious with me for teaching elven skills to a human. He feared that more would follow to learn our ways. I was watched closely for several years after you left. I apologize for any trouble that I gave you. My punishment was more a nuisance than serious, and seeing what benefit gave you more than makes up for that." Desalia smiled. "Benefit indeed. I was working towards uniting the Trae Shaalta even before this crisis with the Union arose, and it was the skill you taught me, allied with the strength and courage of Gilth, which has allowed me to succeed and heal rifts between tribes slowly drifting apart since the last great alliance 2 centuries ago. You always did have grand plans." "Yes," chuckled Desalia. "If anything, I should thank this union. Their actions have greatly aided my cause. But then again, our people have been unified by great Triquar and powerful Erst before, but it never lasts for long. I am hoping that by teaching my daughter, who has inherited my connection to the winds, the techniques you taught me, that she can lead when my life mate and I have gone to the sky." "A noble goal, old friend," said Val'inar, smiling, "but the future is dark while this malevolence in the Telmaran Union still exists. You really are serious about there being a threat to all Sirana, aren't you?" "Yes, I am afraid that I am." "Very well, I will do whatever I can to aid your cause. Spirits know that I owe you much, and it sounds as though it will be in my best interest as well." "Val'inar, thank you. Thank you. I fear that we will all need each other's help before this is over." "Val'inar, I," began Desalia, but she stopped short. They were quite close to each other now, and she looked up into his eyes. Clear brown met piercing blue, and for a moment something silent seemed to pass between them. It has gotten late. Gilf is at a place to sleep prepared for you. He will convey you to the door of Murtzel early in the morning. Thank you, Dasalia, said Val'inar, moving towards the entrance before looking back. Goodbye and good fortune to you. Be careful, Val'inar, said Dasalia, returning to her throne. They knew you were coming. Wind guide you. Val'inar turned and left the Triquar's chamber and soon found Gilf. He was led to a room in another part of the great tent where a bed had been prepared for him. He laid himself down, and as he drifted off to sleep, his mind turned between the memories of 20 years past and the thoughts of what lay ahead of him. All right, that is chapter 5. I would really love to hear your thoughts on my reading, the content of the chapter, any other thoughts you have on my book as a whole so far. I also hope you check out my book, The Shadow of the Past, as well as my second book, And the Sun Burned Red. Both of them are available on Amazon and linked below. Also, please check out my website, as well as follow me on my various socials, also linked below. I hope you enjoyed yet another Storytime Thursday. I hope you all have a wonderful day and get the chance to do or experience something creative. And I'll catch you on the next one.